Welcome to Alaska Weather, a production of Alaska Public Media and the National Weather Service, Alaska Region. Produced and broadcast daily from the studios of KAKM, Alaska Weather provides complete forecasts, public, marine, and aviation for all of Alaska. Alaska Weather is made possible by the following sponsors.
If you served in the military, the Alaska VA welcomes you home and thanks you for your service. You may be eligible for VA healthcare benefits, including reimbursement for your care at 26 tribal health facilities and their more than 180 outlying clinics throughout the state of Alaska. Apply online in less than 5 minutes.
The National Weather Service.
Good Tuesday, everyone. I'm meteorologist Dave Snider with the National Weather Service. It's the 2nd of September. As always, we encourage you to stay up to date with your latest weather information and observations simply by going to weather.gov/Alaska or arh.noaa.gov. You can call us on the weather info line for your forecast information at 800-472-0391. That works anywhere in Alaska. And find us on Twitter, on Facebook under NWS Alaska, and on YouTube. In the afternoon, you'll get your daily afternoon map briefings there. And after this show, a little bit later in the evening, you can catch the entire Alaska weather broadcast from our broadcast partner here at Alaska Public. Simply go to AKwx TV in the search bar, and you'll find our latest episodes there. Here's the Alaska weather headlines as we see them tonight. High surf advisory continues for the western Arctic coast and the northern Arctic coast, including areas around Barrow and westward through the Chukchi Sea. We're looking at high surf conditions that offshore is producing 7 to 9 foot seas there, bringing the sea level along the coast anywhere from 1 to 1.5 feet above normal. Wind speeds there up to 35 to 40 miles per hour from the north and west, the highest of which around the western Arctic coast itself from Wainwright and southward. On top of that, much colder air is working its way into the interior, and a blizzard warning is now in effect for the northeastern Brooks Range. Snow is expected from 5 to 10 inches there, mainly above 1,000 feet. The highest will be east of the Dalton Highway. With that comes winds from the west, 35 to as high as 50 miles per hour, especially through some of the passes there. So a blizzard warning that'll go until midnight on Wednesday. A lot of active weather coming in. Also a little bit further south into the interior for the middle Tanana and the upper Tanana Valley in 40 Mile Country. The upper Chena River is under a flood warning at this point. There's been quite a bit of rain there since Monday. Over 2 inches or so has fallen in that basin alone. And as you well know, if you're in the middle Tanana area, the Chena itself has just been pretty high through a good part of the summer, and only, 4 80-degree days in Fairbanks itself. Just a sign of how wet of a season it's been, on top of obviously the record rainfall reported there at the airport. So high water there along the upper Chena. If you're headed out for hunting, make sure you're extra careful in crossing any riverways and waterways there. At the sign of a flooded roadway, make sure you follow the simple rule: turn around, don't drown. It's just not worth your life. Find a different way around if you can, and water levels will remain high probably through the rest of the week there. Again, you can see the high surf conditions there all the way from Barrow southward along the western Arctic coast there, including the Chukchi Seacoast and into the Kotzebue Sound region as well. So be advised, again, the surf conditions will be rough, and sea levels probably a little bit higher than normal. Here's a look at the weather pattern from the bird's eye view out in outer space, and you can see that counterclockwise rotation here. Low pressure just off the coast of Barrow, sweeping in colder and drier air. With that comes stronger winds reaching the northwestern coastline. The heavier rainfall in the brighter band of clouds here coming across the central and eastern interior. Again, that dumped around 2 inches of rain plus in the middle to upper Tanana valleys there. The frontal boundary sagging southward. The clouds have been building across south central and southwestern Alaska all day. Southeastern Alaska enjoying a little more sunshine there. As you look at it with the visible satellite picture, you can see a few more breaks in the cloud cover throughout the day. Here's a look at the early morning hours, and we're just about to that fringe point of the year where we're going to have trouble using the visible satellite picture for a large part of the day. As you can see, a lot of dry air across southeast, across the Gulf of Alaska, and then you can see that speckled mackerel type texture here across the Bering Sea. A sign of some cold air aloft, but not a whole lot of precipitation with that just yet. Low clouds, fog, and stratus across a good part of the Bering. And then another wave of colder air coming out of the Chukchi seacoast will reinforce the weather that's already in place across northern Alaska tonight. So pretty active pattern right now. And again, one that's reinforcing that colder and snowier weather that's, of course, gradually working its way southward as we get closer and closer to mid to late fall. Today's weather map shows that cold front north of the Alaska Range. We had some showers across southwest and the interior today, mainly along the Yukon Valley and west into the Seward Peninsula. Already snow was falling. In fact, heavy snow was falling around Barrow earlier this afternoon. 991 millibar low there just off the coast, and you can see the tight packing of the pressure gradients indicating there's probably a lot of wind reaching the northwestern coastline there. If you have any pictures that you'd like to share with us, if you're up there across the western Arctic coast, we'd love to see them. You can send them to me at david.snider, S-N-I-D-E-R, of course, at NOAA.gov, or post them to our Facebook page. That's a really easy way to reach us that way. High pressure sitting across the southern Bering at 1,024 millibars is slowing that southern progression of the front. At the same time, it's working with warmer and wetter air across the western Gulf, and high pressure sitting across the central and eastern Gulf at 1,030 millibars. It's slowly working its way northward toward the Alaska Peninsula, and eventually will re-moisten the atmosphere there across the southern part of Kodiak Island. Now, as we head into tonight, low pressure is organizing across south central. There's an opportunity for some rain and showers, a better chance for more steadier rainfall the further north you go, and at elevation along the Alaska Range, there's probably going to be some snow. Showers across the north and eastern parts of southeastern Alaska and the Wrangell-St. Elias region into just about Cordova. Once you get north of the range, things should dry out. There'll probably be some clear skies there once you get south of the Yukon Valley. North of that, though, clouds quickly fill in, and that blast of colder air working across the Brooks Range will reveal itself in the form of snow and maybe rain and snow around the Kobuk and Noatak valleys. Out across Kotzebue Sound, there's still enough warm air. There might be some areas of rainfall, but watch for a few snowflakes to mix in with that. Here come the northwest winds working into Barrow and parts of the Beaufort Seacoast, and the snow will fly there, but again, a much better chance for blizzard conditions there at elevation above 1,000 feet in the northeastern Brooks Range. Heading into Wednesday, rain and snow will be likely for the coastal plain. Watch for blizzard conditions then across the north and eastern Brooks Range and the passes there around Adigan Pass especially. Watch for some heavier snowfall. Some of that could equal 5 to 10 inches of snow already this season. Out across the west around the Seward Peninsula, high pressure should set up, and that will break apart some of the cloud cover for the middle and lower Yukon valleys into the YK Delta. Frontal boundary will just ooze its way across the southern coastline, slowly working its way southward, and that'll be the focus for some showers and clouds during the day. A better chance for some steadier rainfall in the morning for places around the Kenai Peninsula and the Mat-Su valleys and Anchorage Bowl. And then during the afternoon, some of that should start to let up as we go. Now out across the western Gulf, you can see low pressures trying to work its way up around the high pressure system and snake its way in between another system out across the southern Bering. So what happens is the warmer air starts to work up toward Kodiak Island and will try and work its way toward this frontal boundary. We kind of get into a weather sandwich across the north and western parts of the Gulf. With that, a steadier rainfall across the Alaska Peninsula, the occlusion still south of the chain, and as we get into Thursday, the front finally winds over the Gulf of Alaska, high pressure drops southward, and we start to see more clouds building just offshore of southeastern Alaska. So rain's coming your way with rainfall developing across the northern coast. Maybe a slightly drier day across south central, but the clouds will probably return fairly quickly. Low pressure hovering right over Kodiak Island means a better chance for rainfall and clouds for you and probably lower ceilings. And a frontal boundary stretching across the Alaska Peninsula to the eastern chain will kind of fall apart as it gets into Friday, as it wraps up on itself. Looking northward, the front across the Alaska Range is falling apart. Still with us, but it's just gradually hanging on. We look northward still, and clouds are breaking up across the Yukon Valley, and then we're back into winter mode with high pressure trying to settle things down. We have a wave of low pressure that's turning into more of a trough than a blast of colder air, but rain and snow is still possible across the Arctic coast with snow at elevation. The heavier snowfall and wind should be winding down for the Brooks Range there, so the blizzard warning will likely have ended at that point, and high pressure is back over the Bering at 1,019 millibars. So quite an active pattern across a good part of Alaska, kind of being sandwiched in between on the north and the south sides, with the interior getting at least a little bit of the rainfall that's slowly working its way out starting tonight and tomorrow. Now, temperatures across southeast have been in the 50s and 60s today, from Petersburg to Juneau to Sitka, 58 degrees there. Higher was 58 degrees, and that in Ketchikan in the lower 60s. Prince William Sound saw some cooler weather around Valdez at 52 late this afternoon, 61 in Kenai, 60 in Anchorage. Talkeetna was about 55. Eagle and Northway were both cooler in the upper 40s with plenty of clouds around Fairbanks today. The temperature was in the upper 40s, almost 50 degrees. Fort Yukon was 48. And once you get into the Brooks Range, you can see where winter is starting to rear its head just a little bit. Upper 30s there for AKwx Pass and Arctic Village. All of the Arctic coast showed temperatures below 40 degrees this afternoon. 32 in Barrow, 38 in Wainwright. Kotzebue Sound in the lower to mid 40s with Nome at 46. St. Lawrence Island showed 52 by late afternoon. The lower Yukon Valley was in the lower 50s around Grayling, 50 degrees there, as well as in McGrath. At around 53 degrees for Bethel, 57 in Nunivak Island. And around Southwest and Bristol Bay, temps were generally in the lower 60s. The Alaska Peninsula in the mid to upper 50s. Sandpoint 57. Cold Bay and False Pass both in the upper 50s with Dutch Harbor, Unalaska at 53. A milder 60 out in Kodiak with mid 50s for St. Paul and St. George with the Central Aleutians in the lower to mid 50s and 53 around Attu. Overnight low temperatures will still remain somewhat mild south of the Yukon Valley and into Bristol Bay. 52 in Kodiak, lower 50s for the Chain and the Pribilofs near 50 degrees. Upper 40s to lower 50s for southeast. South Central likely in the mid 40s tonight, with the interior hitting the freezing point for many areas along and north of the Yukon Valley, including Nome at 32. The Brooks Range generally in the mid-20s tonight, so Arctic Village and AKwx Pass both in the mid-20s there at least. 27 for Barrow, Kaktovik, and many areas along the Chukchi Seacoast will be a little bit cooler in the lower 30s overnight, with high temperatures tomorrow only rebounding to the upper 30s to about 40 degrees there. Around Shishmaref and Kotzebue, look for temps in the mid-40s, 47 in Nome. Southwestern stations in the lower 60s around Bristol Bay, 57 in Kodiak, and places like Dutch Harbor and Unalaska tomorrow. Upper 50s and lower 60s for southeast. Prince William Sound back in the lower to mid-50s. And the interior generally around 50 degrees, a little bit milder for you tomorrow around Fairbanks with fewer clouds. Same goes for Tanana. Flying weather should expect IFR conditions for a large part of the Arctic coast tomorrow. Maybe some improvement by late day across the Chukchi Seacoast, but I would plan on very low ceilings and poor flying conditions there. Southeast looking at MVFR conditions mainly across the northern half from Sitka to Petersburg and northward. IFR developing across the southern coast of Kodiak Island out toward the Alaska Peninsula and out across the western Bering Sea, especially the western chain. Your pass conditions, expect changing conditions in the Brooks Range passes, of course. MVFR with snow developing in many cases there. MVFR conditions at least through Adigan Pass, probably looking at snow developing in lowered ceilings as the day goes on. Lake Clark and Merrill Pass expecting some improvement toward VFR conditions. Same goes for Rainy Pass. Windy Pass should see visual flight rule. Isabel Pass expected to be VFR by the end of Wednesday. MVFR developing for Mentasta Pass, so lower visibility as the day goes on. And Tanita Pass should see visual flight rule. Portage Pass we expect to see marginal conditions, especially in the eastern side in the morning with improvement during the day to VFR. And Chilkoot and White Pass, as you just saw, should be marginal through a good part of the day. The cold air is dropping southward of the Brooks Range. The surface freezing line now south of the Brooks Range summits and almost into Kotzebue Sound. Freezing lines are packed aloft anywhere from 2,000 to 10,000 feet all the way down to Kodiak Island, 8,000 to 10,000 feet for a good part of southeastern Alaska, and the western coast between 4,000 and 8,000 feet, with the Aleutian chain hovering close to 10,000 feet for your Wednesday. There is icing potential, as you would imagine, with this type of weather system, generally above 2,000 feet and below 9,000 feet. Out across the Gulf, you'll have to go a lot higher, above 8,000 to 16,000 feet there to reach any occasional widespread moderate. And another burst of moisture and cold air coming across from the Gulf of Anadyr should be watched if you're traveling out across the west coast in the coming days. That right now is below 7,000 feet. The jet stream is to blame for our weather pattern right now. You can see that north and westerly flow aloft around 30,000 feet. This is the fast-moving river of air that grabs a hold of some of the big blocks of cold and warm air across the entire planet. In this case, we have cold air coming out of the Arctic and dropping southward across the interior of Alaska. There is warmer air to be had across the Gulf of Alaska, and the moisture is meeting up with it as it rounds into western parts of the Gulf. A little bit faster wind coming across the Alaska Peninsula to southeastern Alaska is holding that at bay right now. Those wind speeds aloft around 60 to 75 knots across that 30,000 foot level. At 9,000 feet, we have more of a westerly flow coming in at 20 to 35 knots across the Yukon Valley. The northwest also looking at more of a northwesterly flow, 20 to 40 knots. The strongest winds north of Kaktovik. Out across the Gulf of Alaska, winds are generally from the south and the western sections there at 25 knots, more from the west and northwest across southeastern Alaska, and light winds across the Bering at this point. More of a westerly flow crossing the Pribilovs in the interior at 10 to 15 knots. The stronger winds there north of the Brooks Range from 30 to 40 knots, those coming in from the west and northwest. And at 3,000 feet for southeastern Alaska, winds from 20 to 30 knots coming in mainly from the west. to the Panhandle, and low pressure sitting just south of Unalaska Dutch Harbor is bringing in winds from the east and southeast around 20 knots. Putting it all together with turbulence, you'll notice a broad area across the coastal plain, the Arctic coast, and a good chunk of the Brooks Range, looking at least some chop there, and some of that could reach occasional to widespread moderate across the Brooks Range summits and southward toward Arctic Village. Out across the Gulf, below 4,000 feet, do expect many areas there west and south of Kodiak Island and south of Sand Point to at least see some light to isolated moderate throughout the day. That's a look at your aviation forecast. We'll be back with your marine weather here in just a few minutes. Stay tuned.
Okay, we're all set. Oil's okay, gas is sumped, hydraulic reservoir is full. Now that your pre-flight's complete, it's a good idea to go and get a weather briefing from your local flight service station. In this country, it's real important. How's it going, Dick?
Pretty good, Don. How you doing this morning?
Yeah, good. Heading up to the hill today, Southeast Fork. What do you got for weather up in that area?
Well, basically, we've got a pretty well entrenched high-pressure system over Siberia. It's keeping the lows pretty well south of us along the chain and the peninsula. We'll probably be on the fringe area up here of some middle and high clouds, 12,000 scattered with high thin cirrus. Lower clouds and possibly some light precipitation in the southern Susitna Valley, but I don't expect any up in the northern valley or along the range today.
Okay. All right, real good. Thanks, Dick. And we'll file a flight plan. Because of some of the extreme weather conditions up on the glacier and the environment there, we want to be sure and bring some special survival gear along. For sure, a couple of sleeping bags, an extra parka, some snowshoes, some good survival gear. Your life could depend on it. Okay, a good count is a word cigar. That includes C for controls, that controls move free and easy. I for instruments. I've got that's your directional gyro set, altimeter set. Gauges are in the green. Top flap open. G, gas. A, attitude. R, rudder set. Roger, keep filing face holes on board the aircraft. I have 4 hours of fuel on board, maybe 2 hours in route, southeast for the information. Survival gear on board, 2 hours in route, and last one, all up field. As we start gaining altitude, we'll slowly start losing our manifold pressure because of the density of the air. So as we climb, I'll slowly be creeping into the throttle on that. How do you copy? Okay, Roger,
Mountains already turning that color quickly across a large part of Alaska. Here's a look at today's sea ice edge, and you can see the higher concentrations of the ice pack there well offshore. There's a few areas of some very thin ice north and west of Barrow, and a larger open lead well to the northwest of that. Anytime you want to take a look at the ice edge for planning purposes or just curiosity, weather.gov/anchorage/ice.php, and you can find the tools you need to make a map very similar to this. Here's a look at the forecast now for southeastern Alaska. The winds should be fairly light, a little bit more of an onshore flow along coastal areas around 20 knots from the west and southwest. Seas generally 7 feet north and south across the inner waterways. More of a southerly flow in the north and south Lynn Canal, 20 knots with a 4-foot sea. Southerlies are a little bit slower as you head into Frederick Sound with a 3-foot sea there. Northwesterlies into Clarence Strait at 15 knots with a 3-foot sea. By Thursday, the winds reverse course, more of a southeasterly flow there, about 10 knots, and you'll get into more of a southerly flow across the Lynn Canal, 15 knots with a 4-foot sea. Coastal winds generally from the south and east. About 10 knots or so from 6 to 7 feet there on Thursday in southeast. Now south central looking at a light and variable flow inside of Prince William Sound. Light north and northeasterly winds coming through Cook Inlet at 10 to 15 knots, and more of a westerly flow crossing the Barren Islands, picking up speed as it heads into the Gulf at 20 knots there. You'll find similar conditions outside of Resurrection Bay, and southwesterlies east of Kodiak Island with a 5-foot sea. By Thursday, winds are still light and variable. Expect building winds throughout the day across the western Gulf, 15 to 20 knots with a 4 to 5-foot sea. Easterlies coming ashore to the eastern side of Kodiak Island, and northeasterlies inside of Shelikof Strait with a 5-foot sea. Northeasterlies around 10 knots from Anchorage all the way down to Kenai, and then more of an easterly flow west of the Barren Islands at 15 knots with a 4-foot sea on Thursday. Look for a variable flow inside of Bristol Bay at 10 knots with a 2-foot sea for Wednesday. Easterly south of Kodiak Island through Castle Cape and into Chignik at 20 knots. A northeasterly flow a little bit further south. Northeasterlies also north of Cold Bay with a 4-foot sea on Wednesday at 15 knots, becoming northerly at 20 knots by Thursday. Northeasterlies inside of Bristol Bay at 15 knots. Southeasterlies through Castle Cape and into Chignik with a 6-foot sea, and easterlies south of Sand Point and King Cove at 10 knots with a 7-foot sea by Thursday. Across the Aleutians, look for more of a north and northeasterly flow cutting across the central and eastern chain. More of a variable wind north of Adak and Atka with 3 to 4-foot seas on the north side and 4 to 5-foot seas, even 6-foot seas south of Unalaska and Nikolsky by Wednesday. By Thursday, light and variable winds in the west. North and northeasterly winds continue for the central and eastern chain with the highest seas up to 7 feet south of Nikolsky and Unalaska. And on the Bering Sea side, northerlies at 20 knots continue there from Unalaska out toward Nikolsky as well. Across the west coast, more of an east and southeasterly flow, rounding high pressure there with a light and variable flow from the Pribilofs to the up the Kuskokwim Bay region around 10 knots. Southerlies across the St. Matthew Island waters could bring seas up to 5 feet there by Wednesday. That turns to more of a southwesterly direction by Thursday afternoon, and variable flow north of Nunivak Island should keep winds light and variable with a 2-foot sea. Southerlies continue for St. Lawrence Island, but we'll get northerly flow from the Kuskokwim Bay all the way out toward the Pribilofs at 15 knots with a 4-foot sea. Now here's the exciting part. Across the Arctic coast, look for strong winds across Prudhoe Bay and Kaktovik. Winds there from 35 knots, 7-foot seas, and small craft advisories are expected for many areas there, along with a threat for freezing spray. Thursday, the winds diminish across the west. We'll still have some stronger winds north of Prudhoe Bay to Kaktovik, with west and northwesterly winds and seas from 7 to 9 feet, and freezing spray is still a possibility heading through Thursday. A quick recap of tonight's weather shows another cold front working across the Brooks Range. That will bring snow levels down to about 1,000 feet after midnight tonight. For the northeastern Brooks Range, that could include 5 to 10 inches of snow by midnight Wednesday, so blizzard warnings are in effect there, along with strong and gusty winds up to 50 miles per hour. And look for decreasing weather trends there as we get into Thursday. Thanks for watching Alaska Weather.
These forecasts are to be used for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating. Alaska Weather is made possible by the following sponsors.
The National Weather Service.
Cook Inlet Tug and Barge is a marine transportation company specializing in harbor services with a primary marketing focus on the Port of Anchorage, providing their customers with quality-based service specifically tailored to their needs.